for coming. It is a pleasure to introduce longtime friend and heritage colleague Heather Bachman. Many of you have seen Heather's work in the community. You might not have known it was Heather's work. Walking around the lake, the county plaques adorn the water frontage, and so be sure to look at those next time, maybe a little more closely. There are historical markers both at Tumwater Falls Park and at the historical park that are part of the visitor experience to Tumwater Falls area. And in the 90s, when a group of citizens gathered to save the historic Bigelow House on our east side, it was Heather who headed up the restoration of that historic structure. If you have done any house remodeling or restoration, you have a slice of the experience that Heather had in taking on a full throttle restoration of a structure about 130 years old at that time, a little older. It's at the center of her charming and poignant work, The Indian Shirt Story, which we are all gathered today to hear about. If you haven't visited the Bigelow House Museum, do take the time to do so and enter a charming and historic house filled with authentic early territorial and some Oregon Trail artifacts. And kindly, the museum is going to be open today post presentation, is that correct? For yes. Visitors.
At 1:30.
At 1:30, and also will be open to the public beginning on Memorial Day weekend on Sunday afternoons, also open by appointment. And it's a wonderful historic resource in our community and very well worth visiting and supporting. And it is also part of the newly formed Olympia Historical Society and Bigelow House Museum. Heather has had a long and respected career as a historian, published a number of works, including the Tumwater History with colleague Carla Wolfsberg, and Olympia Lacey Tumwater with Shanna Stevenson. She has also been a freelance writer and published articles in National Geographic Traveler, Travel and Leisure magazine, and has had a humorous essay that is the foundation for this book in American Heritage magazine. Heather is a docent at the Governor's Mansion in her spare time and a community volunteer, and I wanted to leave you with this. Don't miss Heather's wonderful website, heatherbachman.com, and her terrific blog, Backstories. It's a wonderful thing to read, and you learn a lot about history, not only in the Northwest, but the places that Heather and Craig visit on their travels. So thank you all for coming today. We appreciate it, and Heather, welcome to the State Capitol Museum.
Oh,
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. It's gratifying to see people in the seats. I wasn't quite sure when we set this up. That was very nice of Sue to say. What she didn't say was that back in the day, Sue was a director of the Bigelow House Museum, and I was on the board that hired her there, and that is how we met. And she paid me back last Friday by allowing me to Skype at her house on Friday evening with a book club in Alaska that had read the book, and I wasn't set up for Skype, and she was. And so with the time difference and everything, I was sitting in Sue's living room talking to readers in Alaska. So today I'm here talking to you. Sue covered a lot of what I needed to tell you in order to give you background on this whole project. I know for those of you who are regulars here at the Noon Lecture Series that it's a little bit unusual to have someone speaking about a work of fiction. If it's any consolation, I've spent most of my career writing nonfiction. I mostly write about real people who do real things. But there was a point when I decided perhaps it was time to try fiction, and I don't have time to tell you why I thought that was a good idea. But buy me a cup of coffee sometime and we'll go over that story. But I did think, as I started to look at the possibilities for fiction, I did think I'd better keep it based on something I knew about. If I was going to be making up characters and dialogue and plot, I'd better have it be grounded in something I was familiar with and really felt confident and comfortable writing about. So I knew it was going to be Northwest because that's where I'm from and that's what I know about. And I was pretty sure it was going to take place in a town pretty much like the one I live in. And so I thought I would start by reading you the description of that town and see if it's familiar to you too. Port Huron wasn't much of a port. Its bay was far too shallow and its location too far from anywhere for the town to have ever developed more than a minor shipping trade. 150 years ago, men in suspenders and woolen vests had tramped the shores of Ellison Inlet, thick virgin timber on every side, and dreamed of a northwest seaport bigger than Boston or Baltimore. But Seattle's harbor was deeper and closer to the Pacific, and the railroad, when it finally came, missed Port Huron by 30 miles. After that, it was fairly clear the village on Ellison Inlet, named for the great blue herons that waded over the mud at low tide, was never going to amount to as much as its pioneer founders had hoped. Eclipsed by its larger neighbors, Port Huron slowly resigned itself to its fate as a scenic small town. Each year with dredging, the waterfront welcomed a handful of foreign freighters, ships from China, Russia, Korea, hungry for raw Northwest wood. If most of the sawmills were gone now, along with the primeval hemlock and spruce, there were still logging trucks on the highway and tree farms up in the hills. Port Huron had a stone courthouse, a central town square with a statue, and on sunny days, views from the harbor of the distant Olympic Mountains. Kayakers, hikers, and campers stopped to buy groceries and gasoline before heading into the wilderness. Tourists making the usual loop between two famous national parks often stayed for a night. If they were not in a hurry, they bought themselves pastries at Mueller's Bakery and stopped for a tour of the Starkett House, a pioneer homestead on Lincoln Street with an iron fence at the sidewalk and an apple orchard in back. To the consternation of some folks in town, Port Huron was also the home of Lower Puget State College, a free-thinking institution in the woods overlooking the bay. The loggers and farmers of Illahee County shook their heads in amazement at a school that offered no sports teams at all, but boasted both an organic farm and a world music drumming ensemble. Faculty members wore sandals with socks and drank their coffee with soy milk. Students were partial to loud public protests that irritated the hell out of old-timers down at the Anchor Bar. Graduates tended to settle nearby once their studies were over, giving Port Huron a higher percentage of herbal healers and yoga instructors than most summer tourists expected to see when they pulled off the highway for gas. There were still great blue herons, too, solitary, gigantic birds that picked their way through the shallows and lumbered heavily into flight, clumsy as dinosaurs. Real herons stalking muddy beaches, fishing for moon snails and salmon smolts. Fanciful herons painted on storefronts and stenciled on canvas awnings, carved into both sides, north and south, of the welcome sign on the highway, encouraging travelers to drive into town for postcards, road maps, and cold beer. Okay, that's the town in the book. Now, you will have heard reference in that passage to the Starkett House. And that gets into the book because when I started thinking about what do I know about, what can I write about, what can I build fiction on top of, I kept coming back to historic house museum in a small Northwest town. That was something I knew about, and Sue has given you some idea of how I came to know about that. But in thinking about what the possibilities were there, I kept coming back to a couple of things. I should say that the primary plot of the book has to do with what happens when popular culture collides with history. It has to do with what happens when a famous celebrity, in this case a very well-known singer out of Nashville, comes to town to use the house, to use the museum, the historic house, as a backdrop for filming a music video and a television special. And so it's what happens when the celebrity comes to town. And it's what happens to the authenticity of the house when it becomes more associated with the current celebrity than with its own history. So that's the primary plot of the book. But there is, underneath all of that, another historical thread that runs throughout the whole book. And that is taken rather directly from my experience at the Bigelow House. So that's what I want to talk about, since it's supposed to be a history talk. I'm going to talk about that thread of the book today. And when I started considering what the possibilities were for fiction, based on historic house museum, small Northwest town, I kept coming back to a story, a Bigelow family story, that we used to call, behind the scenes, the Indian shirt story. And you'll notice this turns out to be the title of the novel. Now, the Bigelow House Indian shirt story was tremendously problematic for us back in the day, because this is in the mid-1990s when we launched this project. As Sue intimated, the Bigelows had lived in this house for almost 140 years. This house was built like around 1860, we think. And the same family had lived in this house since it was built. The same members of the family had owned and lived in the Bigelow house. And we were now in the third generation by this time. It's the grandson of the original builders of the house and his wife were living in the house and had lived there since the 1930s. By the mid-1990s, they were becoming quite elderly and quite concerned about the future of the house. They very much wanted to see the house preserved, and they wanted to see it open to the public. So, at the instigation of the family, a group of community volunteers got together, hardworking, slightly idealistic, not really understanding how much work this was going to be, formed a nonprofit, raised the money to buy the house, landed a grant from the state of Washington to restore the house to its territorial appearance. And then, of course, we had to work on what the programming would be at the house. What kind of experience would visitors have when they came there? What would the tour be like? What would the exhibits be like? What story were we telling in the house? We have this house, we have these furnishings. You know, what does it add up to? One of the things we decided we weren't going to do was tell the Indian shirt story, because it was a very problematic story for us. It was a story that had been associated with the house for a long time. The primary characters in it, were family members, sorry, and it was something that the family was still telling about the house, but by modern standards, this story was very offensive to Native American people, and we just couldn't tell it. And we were very afraid if we did tell it that we would offend people, and we were especially afraid that if we offended people, it would reflect very badly on the museum, and we just didn't want to do that. So we just didn't tell the story. And that did cause some hurt feelings with the family, because it was an important story to the family, and to that generation of the family, it wasn't a story, to them it wasn't a story about Indian people. It was a story about Grandmother Bigelow and about how brave and resourceful she was back in the day. So it was a point of contention that we weren't telling the story, but we didn't want to tell it. And I started thinking about what the fictional possibilities were in that situation. One of the threads of the story is what happens if you do tell it? What are the consequences of telling a story like that? So that's part of the book. But also, as I started thinking about the actual story at the Bigelow house, I started thinking about two things. One is, for a story to have persisted like that, I had a hunch, couldn't prove it, had a hunch, it was based on something. That even though in this form that we didn't want to tell because it portrayed Indians in a really unfortunate light, somehow I felt like underneath all of that, something had happened. There's a kernel of truth in there somehow, not as the story's being told now, but underneath, if you peel back all the layers, you would find something there, some original encounter between the white American pioneer family and American Indian people who were here before they got here, because that's what the story's about. It's about an encounter between those two groups. And then I started thinking, okay, well, whatever that original encounter was, there would have been two sides to it. There would have been two perspectives. We know what the white perspective was. At least we know how that's come down to us. We know how that story has turned out. But there would have been another perspective. There would have been the Indian perspective on whatever that original encounter was. And what would have happened to the story on that side if that story got told through the Indian families, through the generation? What would the story look like when it got to the same place where we have this story that we don't want to tell because it's embarrassing? So that's what I started playing with in the book. And everything I came up with for fiction to explain the original encounter and the way the story morphs through the ages is all completely out of my own brain. It's completely made up. It is fiction. I did, however, use largely the Indian shirt story as we knew it at the Bigelow house. It's a little nod from me to my source material, and also because it was so good I couldn't improve on it. It was just so much fun to deconstruct that story. But I thought today, since this is a history talk, I would talk about the real Indian shirt story as it is known in the Bigelow archives, and take you through 4 versions of it that I have found in print. I I think you'll see how the story changes over time. You'll also see why we didn't want to tell it. So I'm going to start. Does this sound interesting at all to you? Yes. Because we could just go straight to questions if you'd rather. Okay, it starts. I'm going to start with a version that ran in a Tacoma paper in 1922. I'm going to watch the time here because once I start talking. I wish I held the whole broadsheet. I don't. But here we have, you can see part of the headline, Indians Haunted Pioneer of, and then this was Olympia over here. So this is a story that ran in 1922 in the Tacoma paper, in the Tacoma Sunday Ledger, November of 1922. And it has a picture here of Anne Elizabeth Bigelow. This was the first generation of Bigelows in Olympia. And this is an interview with her. She's almost 90 in 1922. And this is an interview with her about her pioneer experience. Now, many of you know that in the early 1900s, there was a resurgence of interest in the pioneer stories. We'd gone from the pioneer generation being the current generation to being the older generation we don't really care about anymore to all of a sudden, oh my gosh, they're dying, we better get their stories. And Ed Eckley here has pointed out to me more than once that's very similar to the way we're treating the World War II generation now, right? To me, it's just my parents. They don't look that special. But but apparently they're the greatest generation. So we have the same thing going on here in the early 1900s, where we think, oh gosh, we'd better get their stories down before it's too late. So we have here an interview with Mrs. Anne Elizabeth Bigelow, who came west at the age of 15 with her family in 1851. It's the same year that Daniel Bigelow came out, but they weren't married, they didn't know each other, they met and married out here, but they did come the same year. He was quite a bit older than she was. So this is Anne Elizabeth Bigelow, who married Daniel Bigelow, and they built the Bigelow house, the White House over on the east side that you're all going to go see this afternoon if you haven't already seen it. Daniel Bigelow arrives in Olympia in the winter of 1852 and immediately files a land claim over on the east side of the bay where the house is now. The house sits on the last acre of that land claim. And he cleared enough space to build himself a small cabin. Cleared some trees, built a cabin. He then, in 1854, he marries Anne Elizabeth, who is only about 19. He's in his middle 30s. She's about 19 when they marry. And she moves into that little cabin, and then together they build the big house in a few years after that, by 1860, we think. So here's this interview with Anne Elizabeth. And it talks about her coming across the trail. It talks about her moving into this little cabin. It talks about how she taught school before she got married. It's all in quote marks. All these anecdotes in the interview are in quote marks, except in the middle of it, we have the Indian shirt story. And it's the Indian shirt story pretty much as it was still being told in the 1990s. It's a little bit different. I think it's significant, and if I have time, I will talk about why I think this is significant. It's not in quote marks. It doesn't actually attribute this story to Anne Elizabeth, although she's the star of the story. Everything else in the newspaper article reads like an interview. This is just kind of pasted in the middle of it, this story about her. I'm going to read it in all of its 1922 yellow journalism splendor. And please remember, these are not my words. These are the words of the person who wrote the story. One evening, the two small Bigelow children slept serenely in their cradles. Mrs. Bigelow was alone and was making shirts for her husband. Two Indians appeared. Those shirts looked as marvelous to them as the flashy American silk shirts do to our present-day immigrants. "We want," stated the Indians. There was no argument. Mrs. Bigelow gave him the shirts. The next day, another young buck appeared. He had seen the new finery of the other two shirt-bedecked Indians. He was indeed shirt-shocked. "Me want shirt," he demanded. "But I have no more," said Mrs. Bigelow, trembling. "But me want one. Gave others some." His guttural voice sounded very stubborn. It looked like a case of shirts or scalps. Mrs. Bigelow's eye fell on a flour sack. She grabbed it up, cut a hole in the top of the sack and one at each side. She pulled the crude garment over the young buck's head. He smiled contentedly. "Heap fine shirt." Thus was the cleverness of these pioneer mothers. Okay, did that make anyone uncomfortable? Okay, we couldn't use it. But still, it has persisted. It's been told through the generations. It's still being told. You know how many stories have been told that no one's telling? But this one has somehow survived. So like, what does it mean, you know? So anyway, the next reference we find to the Indian shirt story, 3 years later, Anne Elizabeth dies. This is her obituary in an Anne Olympia paper. It's in the Evening Recorder. It's in February of 1926, and whoever wrote the obituary had this story in his file, his or her file, because entire phrases are taken out of this 1922 story that ran in the Tacoma paper. What ends up in her obituary? The Indian shirt story. It's the same story, it's shorter, it doesn't have all the pidgin English, but it's the same story, including the babies sleeping serenely in their cradle. So you notice in this version, the Indian people are very threatening. Mrs. Bigelow in this version is very brave and very resourceful. And it's very scary. And the Indians are very demanding. They come in and they want something that they have no reason to expect to get. They just walk in and say, I want it. So she comes off as, you know, it's very melodramatic. She's the real hero. And it makes it into her obituary. So by this time, it's codified. It's part of her mythology. It's no wonder it's still being told decades later in the house. Okay, now we have this version. This was sent to me by someone sitting in the front row in 1910. Still got the slug, it's an email I got from someone who knew I was working on the novel, and it was Anne. And here's what she said. I was just looking at the Ole Historical Society website and reading a bit of Blankenship's Lights and Shades of Pioneer Life, and I came across this, and she sent it to me. 1923, Lights and Shades of Pioneer Life. So we have here another collection of pioneer reminiscences and stories, and this is in it. And I looked it up because she wasn't kidding me, it was in there. The language in this one is even worse, and I'm not going to read it all. I will just read the plot. A pioneer was building a house back in the 60s. An Indian applied for a job and was put to work with the understanding that he would receive a shirt for his pay. The first Indian had no sooner gone to work than a second one applied. The pioneer said there were no more jobs as he had but one shirt. The quick-witted wife was always ready to meet an emergency. She told the husband to put the Siwash to work and she would provide the shirt. On completion of the job, the first Indian was presented with his shirt and put it on where it was destined to remain until it dropped off. The second Indian was met by the ingenious wife with a flour sack, opened at one end with holes cut in the other for head and arms. However, the result was not satisfactory, and it goes on to say that the first Indian was jealous of the flour sack shirt because it had printing on it, lettering on it that said, Tumwater Mills. So that's a nice localized detail in that story. You'll notice this one is not specifically about the Bigelows. It doesn't mention names. It just says an old pioneer. But it has the local detail. So it's a local story in some way. Is it the same story? Well, let's just count. We have Indians, shirts, not enough shirts for the Indian people. We solve it with the flour sack, and it's the woman who comes up with the idea. But the tone of this one is very different. It's not scary. The Indian people are not presented favorably, but they are not threatening. It's not dangerous. There are no babies sleeping serenely in their cradle. The woman is not alone. In fact, the encounter is really between the pioneer who's building the house and the Indian workers. It's a business deal. There's more workers than there's pay, in effect. And it's the smart wife who comes up with the solution. It's the same story, but it does start to make you wonder, well, is it the Bigelow story, or does everybody have an Indian shirt story in their past? Is it just one of the, because there are stories like that sort of, every pioneer family has some variation on the story, and you don't really know that it actually happened in all of these places. There's one about pies on the windowsill that shows up a lot, that, you know, Indian people stealing pies cooling on the windowsill. Everybody's got one of those in their family. So maybe everyone has a flour sack shirt story too, but it seems a little suspicious. It's kind of specific. So here we have what I like to call the smoking gun. I think this is the original Bigelow Indian shirt story. This is actually from the Olympian in 1950, which is a little late for a pioneer story, except that 1950 is the centennial year for Olympia. It's when Olympia was celebrating its 100 years. And the Olympian published a sort of special souvenir edition, which reprinted stories from the past 100 years of Olympia newspapering. And they talk about, in this story that's reproduced, talks about more than 100 pioneers of Washington Territory gathered in Olympia March 2, 1903, to celebrate 50 years of progress. Well, that would be 50 years since the creation of Washington Territory, right? Since the creation of Washington separate from Oregon Territory. Who's one of the pioneers at this gathering of 100 pioneers? Plus 100 plus pioneers? It's Mr. Daniel Bigelow. Mr. Bigelow told an amusing incident in connection with the building of his house. And it talks about where the house was. And guess what? It is the Bigelow house. I built my own house, Mr. Bigelow said, out of timber which I hewed myself. I employed an Indian to carry some of this timber for me and promised to give him a shirt in payment. Another Indian heard of the bargain and wanted a shirt too. He insisted upon helping. We did not care to offend the red men in those days, so I let him work. But I was embarrassed, for I had only one shirt. How was I to pay the second Indian? There was an old maid living in the neighborhood. When she heard of my trouble, she said that she would make the second Indian a shirt. So she took an old flour sack, opened both ends, and cut holes for the arms. She put it on the Indian, and he went away perfectly satisfied. Okay. The tone of this one is really different. We did not care to offend the red men in these days. Okay, we wouldn't use that term. That term in itself is offensive. Old maid's not so great either, can I just point out. But aside from that, it's pretty respectful. I had this dilemma. I hired this guy. We agreed on a price. The second guy showed up. He did the work. I didn't have anything to pay him with. And my neighbor solved the problem. Do you notice this? My neighbor solved the problem. It's not his wife. You know why it's not his wife? Because he wasn't married yet. He's building the cabin. He's cleared the land to build the cabin that she moves into when they get married. She's not even in the story. By the time we get to 1922, she's the only person in the story, the only white person in the babies. The babies are in the story. But it's in 20 years, we've gone from, I hired Indians to help me build my house to I was alone in the house. Except it's not in first person. I did point that out. It's that 1922 version does not appear to come directly from Anne Elizabeth, and yet it's in the middle of this story about her, where she does speak in first person about a lot of stuff. Well, I think this is total speculation on my part, but I think to explain how that changes so quickly, I think you have to look at who wrote the story, who wrote the article for the Tacoma paper in 1922. It's written by a woman named Marie Dunbar, who was a newspaper reporter here in town. She grew up in Olympia. She would go on to become the society reporter for the Seattle Times for a long time, for a couple of decades, under the pseudonym Virginia Boren. So if you're ever doing research and you run into Virginia Boren, her byline, that's Marie Dunbar. Marie Dunbar was, in 1922, married to John Dunbar, who was about to become Attorney General of the state of Washington. He was also the nephew of Anne Elizabeth Bigelow. So when she's doing this interview in 1922, she's interviewing her husband's aunt, her mother-in-law's sister. And my guess is she knows the Indian shirt story from someone else in the family and puts it in the story. Because it doesn't make sense to me that Anne Elizabeth, 20 years after her husband's death, would have so rewritten the story as to make herself the star of it. It just doesn't ring true to me. Could be, I don't know. Maybe she's a bigger egoist than we know. But it's not consistent with what else we know about her, that she would just turn it into this big melodrama with herself at the center of it. But, if Marie heard it from a cousin or her own mother-in-law, who was very much younger than Anne Elizabeth, and perhaps just was confused about the details, and it is 20 years past Daniel Bigelow's death, and there's no one around to correct people if they're telling it the wrong way. So I don't know if that's true or not, but my guess is that's what happens. And once it gets into print, then it becomes the authoritative version. It's in the obituary, and it becomes the way that story is told. I would like to tell you as a footnote that at the time Marie Dunbar was writing that story in 1922, she was living in my house. My house, which is here in the South Capitol neighborhood. I say my husband's sitting right there, is going, oh, what do you mean it's your house? It's, it's our house, but the historic name of the house is the Dunbar house. And the first owners were John and Marie Dunbar. So Marie Dunbar is living in my house when she creates the Indian shirt story as the story that haunts us later. And she's living in the same house where I'm living when I write the novel that's based on her wacky version of the flour sack story. So that's, now we're back to living in a small town again. That's it. That's the historical part. Is anybody, I'm going to throw it open to questions because I'm betting there are some. I'm hoping there are some. There's one.
Why did you choose to make the town and the area fictitious as well as everything else, as opposed to showcasing Olympia and then talking about a fictitious family and house?
Oh, why not make it take place in Olympia?
Yeah, it's sort of more like a Thomas Costain novel where the setting is historical but the story is fictitious. One reason for that probably is that I didn't need it to be the state capital. I didn't want to confuse it with that, because that's a different, that's just a different aspect to that I didn't need for this story. And I kind of wanted it to be, kind of any town. But it wasn't. But it's really, in my head, it's a combination between Olympia and Port Townsend. But I've had other guys, I had someone say, oh man, that really reminded me of Gig Harbor. I had someone say it really reminded me of Sitka, so who knows? Have you heard from Rudy Wagner about Mueller's Bakery?
No one has mentioned that yet. But
the other one is the Lippert Pharmacy, and a good friend of mine, Doris Lippert, is a pharmacist.
Yeah, see, that's the problem. You think you're making it up, and it turns out someone actually is named that, and
Well, she was pleased to be.
She was pleased to be featured. Okay, good.
She was surprised.
Oh, yeah, I bet she was.
How did she know?
Yes.
You want to mention Bob Villa?
No, you do that.
Okay. Well, I thought maybe that was someone.
I really wasn't involved in that
You
very
weren't
much.
involved in that. Well, the character in the book who is the manager for the country music star
Yes.
reminded me a great deal of Bob Villa, the old house, this old house, advanced person. So in the August, I think, what year would this be, 1996, we were having a event at the Bigelow House kind of showcasing the restoration work. And I wrote a press release for the paper, kind of making a fuss about it, and we had pictures, and we got a good cover story in the Olympian. And Bob Villa's people picked it up somehow. They got a hold of this and called up out of the blue and said, we want to feature the Bigelow House on TV. We want to come and do this. And it was pretty fast, about a month, seemed like. And the first time I drove up to meet them, the person who was the advance person for Bob Villa, business cards were blown all over the street. They were everywhere on Glass Avenue. So some of the highlights were Mr. and Mrs. Bigelow still lived in the house. The camera crew and the presswoman were doing yoga in the yard. There were a lot of things that were tough on the elder Bigelows that went on with that. But I kind of thought of that when you talked about the characters in the book, because it did bring a lot of acclaim to the house at the time in the museum, and it was great to be featured, but it was kind of chaotic. It was an interesting kind of comparison of a small town project becoming a national story, and some of the characters were really fun.
Thanks, yes.
Well, I've asked you this before too, Heather, but, and it isn't historical, but trying to select names for your characters, and you said it was difficult. How did you go about that?
Yeah, naming was and remains hard for me in fiction, and that probably comes from writing so much nonfiction. It's like having to come up with names and to make sure they're not the names of somebody. Apparently I didn't with the pharmacy. My main character, the museum director, is named Bess, and there's a reference
in the novel as it was published to where her name came from, and that she believed that she was named after Bess Truman, that her grandmother was a big fan of Bess Truman's, and that her parents had named her Bess because as a nod to her grandmother. I had to cut a chapter from the book that later describes Bess finding out that that isn't, in fact, her own family story. You know, she finds out that her own family story isn't what she thought it was, but I had to cut for length, and that chapter had to go. When I was Skyping with this book group in Alaska on Friday, I had someone ask me about that. She goes, that's such an odd detail about her being named for Bess Truman. Like, what made you do that? And I was like, well, what made me do that was I thought there was going to be more later in the book about it, but I had to cut it for length. And the book club hostess, the person who was hosting the book club meeting, had read my book as typescript. She's a personal friend, and she said, I noticed that was gone, because she had read this story when it was in its longer form. So sometimes you name them, and it turns out different than you thought it was going to. Sometimes it just has to do with the rhythm of the sentence you're introducing the name in. I need a 2-syllable name, you know. I have found you don't want the names to end with S. That gets very complicated when you're writing. Oh, please, someone must have something else they want to ask.
Well, I was just
Oh, you've got more.
No. I just, in the comment about the 1922 article.
Yes.
Even if there was a retraction because Anne Elizabeth Bigelow maybe got upset that this was added, like you say, once that's put in print, the retractions often don't get printed or don't stay with the main article. So
Yeah, once it's in print, it sort of has a life of its own, doesn't it? Oh, we have competing historians. Okay, Carla, go.
Okay, so I'm just curious about those characters, if they are still in your head, and if you're thinking still about them, and if they are going to be moving forward in their lives into another.
There will not be a sequel. This is something that's been asked, but no, it's a standalone book. I do sometimes think about the characters. What I was just going to say, it's too much of a spoiler, so I'm not going to say it, but I'll tell you later on. But I don't want to give away. If I talk about what I was just about to say, I would give away a plot thing that for people who haven't read the book, I don't want to. But I do. They did get very real to me, actually. That was fun. I did miss them. You know, I did, yeah. I had spent a lot of time with them. Ed, what did you want to know?
Well, I was curious when I was reading the fictionalized trial name, Sesquivich.
Yes.
Is that a pun? The part of the point is that
Apparently it is, but I didn't know.
You know, being squeamish about.
Oh, no.
It was occurred to me while I'm reading that you may have been.
It wasn't intentional, but it may have been. And now we're back to Anne's question, how do you create a name? Creating a tribal name was really tough because it needed to sound authentic. I mean, it needed to sound believable. It needed to sound, credible, but it needed to not be an actual tribe. And I Googled that puppy a lot of times to make sure I wasn't accidentally using a real tribal name or tribal word. But I did want to, yes?
Hi, so have any of the tribes reacted to the story?
I haven't heard anything. I would like to. I hope it's favorable. I was very conscious of how I was writing the story. Yes, Sue.
Heather, can you just take a minute to give a thumbnail of the restoration, kind of the timeline on that? When
Okay.
it started and just
Okay.
a few highlights of the main.
Okay, Shanna can correct me. Shanna Stevenson is the one who wrote me into this project. She called me up one day. At the time, she was staff to the Heritage Commission, the Olympia Heritage Commission, and I was on the commission. I was co-chair at the time. And she said, we're trying to put this nonprofit together. Can I put you down as president? She said, I gotta have officers and I can't put my own name down because I'm staff and I gotta get this thing filed today and please, you won't have to do anything, I have to have a president. Well, okay, if I don't have to do anything, okay. You can put my name down. Yeah, okay, well, the timeline was tight. And that had to do with the fact that we got this grant. This is called Cart Before the Horse. We got the grant before we owned the house. And the grant was from the state, and it was to restore the house to its original appearance. And the grant was a lot. I mean, it was like $308,000 or something. We couldn't use it till we owned the house, and we couldn't use it to buy the house. So we couldn't use it until we'd raised the money to purchase the house. So, and we needed to use it before the end of the biennium because we were afraid they would take it away from us if we didn't have it spent. So we were trying to raise the money to buy the house, and we were sort of watching our window for restoration get smaller and smaller and smaller. And we had raised all but about $60,000 of what we needed for the house, and the city of Olympia agreed to lend us the $60,000 that we were short. So we ended up borrowing $60,000 from the nonprofit, borrowed $60,000, and I would like to say paid it back. But at the time, we needed to be able to buy the house. So we bought the house, and we had about, we bought it was Lake Fair weekend when we signed the papers on the house. Guess who had to sign on the papers? The president of the organization. I'm buying a house. I'm buying a really old house that needs a lot of work. So that was summer, and then we started in January. We moved the stuff out of the house. The Bigelows vacated right after Christmas, and we moved all the furniture and all the stuff that was going with the house that we were buying. Had to go into storage. That was January, and we finished. We premiered for our big donors. We didn't have big donors, but we did a little preview on my 39th birthday, so that was July. We did it in 6 months. We did the actual work. We didn't do it ourselves. We had a contractor do it, but we oversaw it, and Shanna and I inhaled a lot of dust. We did, and my husband will tell you that he helped take down the false ceilings in the house. The ceilings had been lowered in the house in the 1950s, and so we needed to take down those false ceilings to restore the original height of the room. And we were on such a tight budget that we just decided we were going to save ourselves whatever it was, $2,000 or whatever it was, by taking down the ceilings ourselves. And so a group of volunteers go over there on a Saturday with the skill saws. Yeah, that was pretty exciting. We brained one of the volunteers, but fortunately it was her husband who had made that cut. So that was Kathy McCormick. Kathy McCormick got hit pretty hard in the head by something that fell off the ceiling. And there were just endless mouse droppings that came down at that time. We have other stories we can't tell you, but we'll tell you that one. Was that what you wanted to? People might be interested in that. You should go see the house. The house is really great. You should also buy the book. The book's pretty good. It's available, actually it's available for retail sale as a digital book. The publisher who picked it up is an e-publisher, and it is available in all ebook formats. As you can see, we did a very small promotional print run. I do have some paperback copies. They are not for sale in the retail outlets. I do have them. If you really have to read it in print, talk to me afterwards. There's probably a way to get one in your hands. You can also get it from the Timberland Library because they have a copy of the paperback. Yeah, it is in the catalog. I have checked. You can actually put a hold on it, and if enough people do that, they will take more copies of it. Yes?
Heather, how long did it take you to write the book?
Pretty much forever. I am a very slow writer. I would say I worked on it for 4 years, probably. And I didn't know, I just kept thinking, I want to stay alive long enough to finish this. I mean, really, I didn't know how long it was going to take. And I achieved that, so that was good. And now we have time, so I will tell you why I wrote it and why I decided to try fiction. I hit a patch in my life where I just couldn't write I couldn't make nonfiction deadlines because we kept running into elderly parent emergencies. And I had one travel story that I had been assigned that I really wanted to do, and it required travel to Southern California, and I ended up postponing that trip 3 times because of emergencies with my mother-in-law. I did manage to take the trip, I did manage to write the story, and I did make the deadline, but it became clear from that experience that I couldn't keep doing, right then I couldn't be doing that kind of work because I couldn't commit to deadlines. I didn't know I would be able to meet them. And he said, he whose mother was the reason I couldn't make the trip, said, well, maybe now is when you think about writing fiction. Which was a bizarre thing for him to say because I had never indicated any interest whatsoever in writing fiction. But that's when I started thinking, okay, well, what am I going to do right now? And what are the possibilities? What would I write about if I were going to write fiction? And turns out it's thinly disguised nonfiction is what I would write about. Yes?
Do you want to do any more nonfiction?
Nonfiction or fiction?
Either one.
Yes. I actually found it very, very hard to start a second novel. It took me a really long time to get traction. I think I finally am working on a second novel. Not gonna say what it is, but let's just say it's something else I know quite a bit about.
It's different.
It's different. It is different. And then in this, I will just tell this because it's too much fun not to. In the month of February, I did a funny little fiction project. I teamed up, see, these people know what it is. Sort of on a dare, I teamed up with another writer, and we decided we would see if we could, in a month's time, if we could pump out a piece of Regency-era romance. This is not something I read. We call it fake Jane Austen. There's a big market for it, and the other writer and I, the other writer also writes serious sort of historical fiction. It was just like, hey, you know what's selling? It's a Regency romance. We could write one of those. So we decided we wouldn't take more than 30 days to do it. I've never met her. She lives in Illinois. So she banged out the first half and sent it to me, and I worked on that while she was working on the second half. And by golly, we did it, and it is 100 pages of dreadful, I am telling you. But we're not putting our own names on it. And we're going to see if it sells. So maybe next year I'll be back here talking about that. Who knows?
So is that in book form?
Now that'll be that'll be digital, I'm sure. I'm sure. I'm not going to tell you what it is, so it doesn't really matter how you can get a hold of it. Okay, well, if there's anything else, we can talk. Otherwise, there's one more.
Now that you've kind of gone into the historical aspect of the Indian shirt story and have some proof of kind of how it started, can you now tell it? Or some version of it after the
You'll have to ask the people who are doing the programming at the house now.
It's historically interesting in the way that the whole thing has expanded, which would be kind of fun to hear as part of the Bigelow House.
Yeah, I mean, I don't usually include it, but.
I
Sure.
have.
You have?
However, I tell the version that Marianne told me.
Uh-huh.
That was a true story.
Yes, and that was one of the things that I always found, and that is the version that we were hearing in the 1990s. There's three Indians that come to the door one at a time, and it's such a European folktale convention. It was one of the things that made me suspicious of the story. It was just so much like a fairy tale. First, the first Indian comes, and then it gets progressively, harder to fulfill the request. Oh my, I'm going to ask this man on the end.
Earlier I was going to ask you to read the Indian version of the story, but now I'm just going to say there is one which is entirely fictional, but it's sort of the counterpart of, and it's a very different story, different motivations, different.
Right, and that runs throughout the novel is the white version of the story and the Indian version of the story and what happens to those two versions over time. Yes?
I was just going to say, I was a tour guide at the state capitol for 17 years. And we had a wonderful story that we would tell in the beginning when I first was there about the chandeliers in the state reception room. And then we found we could not prove that story. So all the tour guides were told they could not tell that story. And of course, what story do you think all the teachers asked to be told? It's the one they couldn't tell. And those are the ones that are like the Indian church story, that are lasting with people.
I've read quite a bit and done quite a bit of research about the pioneers coming across on the Oregon Trail and all of this. And shirts truly are the Indians, that's what they wanted more than anything. And so this is very true about the pioneers. They really wanted shirts. and they would work for shirts, for anything. And the pioneers would even pay just buttons for a day's wages for, and the Native Americans would have that. But shirts, the women who would have come across, I've read quite a few accounts where they would have said, they said, I wish that I would have made more shirts for my husband because we could trade anything for shirts.
That's very interesting. Did I see another hand?
Suggest a t-shirt line for it.
A little bit of swag to go with the story. Should say Tumwater Mills across the front. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I was kind of wondering if in a local tribe's oral tradition, if there are, if there would be a story, but it sounds like it was not an uncommon event if there was a lot of trading of shirts.
I was introduced as a historian, which is really, really flattering, but I'm not. I'm a writer who writes about historical stuff. And what I do know in the research I've done is that it does appear that Indian people adopted Western clothing very quickly, and wouldn't you, if you had the chance to have a ready-made garment instead of having to start with the cedar bark, So I'm sure clothing is a big deal in those early stories. Yes, Mr. Gaucher.
It seems like with the coverage of your talk today and Mr. Dodge being present, you might have the Olympian perpetuating still in yet another version.
If it leads back to the book, I'm okay with that. Yeah. Okay, thank you for coming. It was a lot of fun.